So let's briefly look at its history. Let me tell you a story, a fairy tale of sorts. And like most fairy tales, I want you to get the point, which isn't a literal point, but a series of pictures about the development of social psychology. A long time ago, in a place far, far away, there was a kingdom called Psychologia. Now, Psychologia was a happy but new kingdom. It had its disputes, to be sure, and all sorts of different types of people, but by and large, most people got along just fine. But after many years of this kind of happy existence, trouble started. A certain group of people had a particular idea of what Psychologia should be like, and it wasn't pretty. They thought that Psychologia should be a place where people only responded to whatever their environment was around them. In fact, they believed that this was all there was to human existence. These people called themselves behaviorists. Now, they weren't bad people really, but they were really attached to their one idea. And they thought that other people who didn't agree with their idea ought to be exiled from Psychologia. They worked to gain power and attempted a military coup, and they won. They stormed the castle of the more open-minded people, the functionalists, who were more gently ruling over the land at that time, and took everyone by surprise. To reflect their obsession, they changed the name of Psychologia to Behavioria. Now, the Behaviorians not only had a very strong military, but they also had very strong powers of persuasion. And the combination of the two meant that they did not have any serious opposition for many years. Lots of people were happy about the revolution, and lots of people who weren't so happy couldn't do anything about it. But even so, there were lots of underground movements. The Behaviorians were ruthless leaders, and they did not tolerate dissent very kindly. But many people were concerned that their vision of people as mere responders to their environment wasn't quite right, or at least wasn't quite complete. Underground, the size and power of these movements began to quietly grow. Now, there were a number of these groups that operated somewhat independently. There was Humania, there was Freudia, but one of the smaller groups called themselves Social Psychologia, or SPs. The SP's main objection to Behavioria was that it did not allow for thoughts and feelings. Can we be human, they asked, without considering thoughts and feelings? They began to form a military underground. They began to have their own agendas, their own ways of doing things. They claimed that they were wanting to return to the glory days of Psychologia, back when its roots of feelings mattered. What happened? Well, eventually everything came to a head. The Behaviorians gradually began to lose control over the kingdom. No one was strong enough to supplant them alone. In fact, had all the opponents of Behavioria united as one, they probably could have overtaken the whole kingdom. But they didn't, because the opponents didn't like each other very much. What they did do, however, was revolt. Each started a revolution to establish their own independent kingdom. And the Behaviorians, whose power had been weakening, didn't have the strength to fight off all of these independent revolutions. Each revolution helped the other to be successful, and the net effect of this, after a very violent military struggle, was to create several tiny little kingdoms. Psychologia had finally been splintered. Now, Social Psychologia finally had its own kingdom, but outside of that kingdom it had very little influence. Nobody really paid much heed to what was going on within its borders. That somewhat changed, perhaps ironically, because of a very bad man in a very different part of the world. That man's name was Adolf Hitler. Now, Hitler was a lunatic who created a movement called Nazism, dedicated to racism and destruction. It was an evil movement. One of the effects it had, however, is that lots of people fled from Hitler's grasp to the area near the heart of the kingdom of Social Psychologia. And in the methods and philosophies that underscored that kingdom, they began to think they might find some answers to what happened in their homeland. In general, the SPs became fascinated by what causes dictators and movements to go bad, a question that was also on the forefront of the mind of much of the world at that time. So this not only shaped the direction of Social Psychologia, it also gave the kingdom a little more respect in the eyes of the world. Indeed, in general, the influence of Behavioria from that point on, and it's still very powerful, began to slip, and the influence of Social Psychology in other nations began to rise. The next part of history is somewhat disputed. After Social Psychologia became a kingdom and began to gain power, another movement began outside its borders. This was called the Cognitive Revolution. Now, social psychology had much in common with this revolution, which put its emphasis on the thinking processes that occurred within the mind. However, it drastically emphasized colder processes, de-emphasizing feelings and looking at cognition. So there was some dispute between the new nation of Cognitia and social psychologia. What is clear, however, is that Cognitia had a huge covert influence on all of the kingdoms that once made up Psychologia, including social psychologia. Many SPs were won over to the Cognitians, and the Cognitia Party was founded in social psychologia that remains to this day as the most dominant controlling party. So social psychologia has been influenced from that day until this by this cognitive revolution. One last note before we leave our fairy tale. Despite the fact that the kingdoms that once comprised Psychologia have for some time operated somewhat separately, there is a growing tendency for these kingdoms to work together. There is now a kind of loose informal alliance between those kingdoms, so that the old psychology is kind of reunited amongst the various different kingdoms. Whether this new tendency continues or some new divisions will emerge remains to be seen.